How can you stop translating in your head? What are some Chinese words that can't be translated? And why is translation a worthwhile learning activity? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. This week's episode is a Q&A focusing on translation because there is a translation challenge for August. If you are interested in that, head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com and sign up. It is completely free, and the main goal of these challenges is to encourage you to invest a little bit more time into learning Chinese than you otherwise would. And in August, the focus is on translation, and so this Q&A is also about translation. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to mention that this episode marks the 4th year of the Hacking Chinese podcast. I have been recording these episodes once a week for 4 years running without missing a single episode, and what I used to do for these anniversary episodes was a Q&A. But now that I'm doing the Q&As once a month instead, because there are so many interesting questions to discuss, it doesn't feel appropriate to just do another Q&A. I mean, I will do that in this episode, but instead I thought I'd take the opportunity to ask you a few questions. I have created a Hacking Chinese podcast listener survey that only takes a few minutes to fill out, and if you were willing to do that, that would make me happy. It would also tell me what you prefer, what you don't prefer, and how I can improve the podcast. So please check the link in the description and take a few minutes to tell me what you think. Okay, so let's get back to the topic of translation and the 3 questions I'm going to answer in this episode. And some of these questions have been sitting in my inbox for a while because we haven't talked about translation in any Q&A, so it's high time to do so. The first question is from many different students, and I've been asked this question many times, and it is about how to stop translating in your head when you're speaking Chinese. The second question comes from Rob, and he wants to know what I think about words that can't be translated from Chinese, and if I have any favorite words in Chinese that are hard to express in other languages. Finally, the third question is from Carmen, who wants to know if translation is actually a worthwhile activity for learning Chinese, and by extension, why am I focusing on translation in this challenge? Isn't it better to try to avoid translation? All these are good questions, and I will do my best to address them. And if you have any questions, you can send them to editor@hackingchinese.com, and I will try to address them in an upcoming episode. So let's start with question number 1, how to stop translating in your head. And before we address the question, this is a good approach. You should generally try to stop translating in your head. And this is true if you're speaking Chinese or if you're listening to Chinese. If you listen to somebody else speak and you need to translate in your head to your native language and only then be able to make sense of what they're saying, this is generally too slow, and it's a well-documented issue for beginner listeners. Sure, if you hear just one word or a phrase, you can translate it to your native language in your head, that works, but if you're listening to connected speech, you will soon fall behind and the translation process is too complicated and too slow. The same is true in the other direction, so when you are speaking, if you first formulate all your thoughts in your native language and then need to translate these into Chinese, things will be slower than they should be, and there are also further complications, because translating from your native language to Chinese is considerably harder than actually speaking in Chinese in the first place. You not only have to think about how to express something in Chinese, but you also have a fixed linguistic structure in your mind in your native language. So it's not just how do I express something in Chinese, it's how do I express this specific wording in Chinese. And this has a lot of negative consequences. For example, it's much more likely that there will be transfer from your native language to Chinese when you speak. So for example, you might end up using the syntax or the sentence structure from your native language when speaking Chinese. Whereas if you're thinking in Chinese in the first place, this might still happen, but it's less likely to do so. So in general, yes, you should try to stop translating in your head. But the question then is, how do you do that? Well, trying to is a good start. You can try to suppress the urge to do this, and this might actually help. But I do think there are more things to do, because most people will just say, I can't think in Chinese, it's too hard, and so on. And I think this is the key to understanding the issue, because if you need to think in English before you say something in Chinese, it simply means you haven't practiced enough, and that the connection between the word and its meaning is not strong enough, and you can't access that connection quickly enough. So let's look at a few beginner-friendly examples to show what I mean. So let's say you have lessons regularly, and when you meet your teacher, you say 老师好, and this could be online or in a class or whatever. But every time you meet, you say 老师好. After you've been doing that for maybe a dozen times, you're not really thinking, oh, I want to greet my teacher, I should say hello or something like that. You're just using this phrase because you've used it many times before and you know it's appropriate to use in this context. You've stopped translating in this case. Something similar happens with numbers. So the first time you need to tell the time in Chinese, you need to think, how do I say 1? And then you say, okay, 1, okay, that's yi. And how do I say o'clock? Okay, that's dian. And how do I say 10? Okay, that's shi. And what was minute again? Okay, fen, and then you say 1:10, 10 past 1. But the thing is, you'll be using the numbers 1 through 10 all the time in different contexts, and even if you haven't studied Chinese for that long, you will have used these numbers so much that you will stop thinking about them. You won't think, oh, how do I say 7 in Chinese? It's just qi, and it's there, you don't need to think about it. So what I'm saying is that this is what it's like for not translating in general. What happens when you've learned more Chinese and you've practiced more and you've communicated more in Chinese is that access to these words will be quick and they don't need to go through English. That's what happens when you don't know these words enough and you haven't practiced using them to communicate. In other words, there is no secret trick that will allow you to not translate suddenly. It's simply about using the language more and getting this connection between the meaning you want to express and the sounds we use in Chinese to express that meaning stronger and faster. That will allow you to access these words without thinking about it and without translation. The same can be said for listening then. So the first time you hear the numbers ba and jiu, you need to think, okay, that means 8 and that means 9. But when you've done this a lot, you stop needing to think about it in English anymore and you can go straight to the meaning. This requires you to hear the words used in different contexts though, and so if you're only listening to the same chapter in your textbook and they happen to be 8 people going on a trip or something like that, that might not be enough for you to really know how to parse this word quickly and without going through English. But if you've heard this number used in hundreds of different contexts where you've had to pay attention to which numbers are used, then you don't really need that. You will stop needing to refer to another language to know what it means. So in essence, there is no trick here. You can't just magically flip a switch and then be able to not use English anymore when you speak or listen to Chinese. This is something you build over time, and the more complicated the thing you want to express, the more likely it is that you need to rely on your native language. Because if you are a beginner, there is no way you're going to be able to formulate very complex things directly in Chinese. Not because it's hard to stop translating, but because you don't have the vocabulary and grammar to actually express what you want to express in Chinese, and then you have no other option than to resort to English. If you do feel that your vocabulary and grammar is up to speaking more in Chinese without translation, but you're still stuck in some kind of translation mode, I think this usually is best solved by focusing on meaning. So you need to practice Chinese in a meaning-focused context. And that means that the goal should be to express something or to understand something, not to practice a specific thing, like a grammar pattern or a word or something, but to express your thoughts or ideas in Chinese. Another thing that can work for intermediate or more advanced students is some kind of time pressure. So you're not just saying things at your own pace, you actually are pressured to speak faster or to express yourself without thinking so much, so you don't have time to go via English. So a good example of this is playing word games where you're supposed to express a word or describe a word without saying the word. And you have a timer and you're supposed to describe as many words successfully as possible. And if you're doing this, you will not think too much about how to say things and you don't have time to go to English before you say things in Chinese. And this clear focus on simply getting the other person to guess the right word as quickly as possible makes it very difficult to focus on anything else. There are more things to say about mental translation, but I think I'll save that for a dedicated article and episode later. So let's move on to question number 2. So this question is from Rob, and he wants to know about untranslatable words and how to deal with them and if I have any favorite ones myself. This question is a little bit tricky and requires us to zoom out a bit, and you can basically approach the question of translatability in 2 ways. First, we can say that everything is translatable. We are all humans, we have the same hardware and largely the same software too. Languages have evolved to allow us to communicate about things that matter to us, and in general, this means that all languages can be used to express all things. Some people say that Chinese is not a very precise language, but then they forget that the Chinese have also landed spacecraft on the dark side of the moon, they build nuclear reactors, and so on, and all these things require an awful lot of precision. However, languages evolved to enable us to express what we want in the context in which we live, and if the context is different or the setting is different, then it follows that the language can also be different, and that might give rise to things you can't translate. Maybe you live far north where it's cold and there's lots of snow, so you have more words to express concepts related to snow. And these words might then be difficult to translate to other languages. On the one hand, I think this is rather obvious. If you have a language that evolved on a tropical island where it never snows, they probably don't have a word for snow, whereas if you grew up on Greenland, you probably have lots of words for snow, and this is nothing strange. However, there are also many misconceptions when it comes to the number of words for snow or other things, and this is partly related to the fact that different languages create words differently. So, for example, in Swedish, we can combine most things and create a new word. So, for example, if snow is wet, there is a word for that. We have blötsnö, so it's literally wet snow, and this is a single word in Swedish. And when we were kids, we liked kramsnö, so that's squeeze snow you can form into snowballs and throw at your friends. And that then is also a word, and I can come up with many of these words, some of which are commonly used and others which I just made up myself, but they would still just be single words in Swedish. In other languages, though, these things might require more than one word to express, but I'm not sure that means that they are not translatable. It just means that this language is not as efficient or succinct when it comes to expressing this type of context. Or sometimes it's just about morphology. How do we form words in this language? So, for example, I'm not sure that powder snow in English, being two words, is less efficient than pudersnö in Swedish, which is one word. So sometimes it's just a matter of definition. If we get back to the original question then, there are of course many things in Chinese culture, for example, that can't really be translated into other languages because these things simply don't exist. And that doesn't mean that they are impossible to explain, it just means that they are inconvenient or inefficient to describe in another language. For example, the concept of qi, as in qigong, is of course very difficult to explain in English. I mean, it's difficult to explain in Chinese too. So in English we just borrow the word and pronounce it a little bit differently and call it qi or something like that. For me, this is more about the underlying concept than the language, so it's not just a matter of translation here. For example, there are many concepts in mathematics which have specific names that I don't know, and of course translating them for me would be very difficult because I don't understand the concepts. But you can then translate them without knowing the concepts simply by looking in a dictionary. But I'm not sure that that is what we're talking about here, and maybe not terribly interesting. Still, from a very practical point of view, there are of course words that are very convenient to say in Chinese, but sometimes don't have a direct equivalent or a convenient or commonly used equivalent in English. I tried to come up with a few common words or phrases in Chinese that are hard or at least inconvenient to say in English. And I came up with 3, and the first one is 麻烦. This is a word I like in Chinese and it's very convenient. It expresses exactly what you want in many cases. But in English you have to use different words. You might say something is a bother, it's troublesome or something like that. But none of them are as succinct and as nice as 麻烦. So this would maybe be one example of a word I think is hard to translate into English. And note that it's not impossible, of course. There is always something you can say in a specific situation. Another one is 加油, which I think is great if you want to cheer somebody on. In English there are lots of other expressions and words that people use, but 加油 kind of encompasses all of them, and I never really know what to say in English here, even though I've studied English for at least twice as long as I've studied Chinese. I also thought of another quintessentially Chinese expression that doesn't really have a good equivalent in English and would require a lot of explaining if you were to say it, and that is 辛苦了. So this is very common in a study situation or at work maybe, and essentially it means that you recognize and empathize with the hard work that somebody has put into a project or something, and you're thanking them for it. However, this is not how people speak in English, and we're much more likely to simply say thank you or something else depending on the context. So again, it's not that it's impossible to translate these phrases and words, it's just that it's very convenient to do so because they fulfill a specific function in a certain language, and then you might need to use more words or different words or use some completely different expression to have the same communicative effect in another language. So I'm curious if you have any words or expressions that you like using in Chinese, but when you try to say them in your native language, you simply draw a blank, you don't know what to say, or you find it very inconvenient to explain your way around something. So if you have any examples to share, please let me know. Before we move on to the third question, I'd like to add something about the idea that nothing can be translated. And this sounds a little bit strange. I mean, there are many very simple words that clearly can be translated. But if you look at them closely, this is actually rarely the case. For example, let's pick a simple word like 面包, which means bread. And this is something I literally learned week 1 of learning Chinese, but in grad school, 6 years later, I realized that this word doesn't really mean what I think it does. I only realized this one morning when a classmate, who's a native speaker of Chinese, asked me if I wanted anything when she was going out. I hadn't had breakfast and was a little bit hungry, so to survive until lunchtime, I asked if she could buy some bread for me, 面包. And 20 minutes later, she came back with something I would definitely call cake and not 面包. And this is actually quite easy to verify. If you do a Google image search for bread in English, you will find, well, what I would consider bread normally, and if I do a search in Swedish, it's largely the same thing. But if you do a search for 面包 in Chinese, you should notice that the pictures are not the same in general. Sure, there is a lot of overlap because most of the things we call bread is also called 面包 in Chinese, but very sweet bread, which is normally considered cakes or similar in English, is also called 面包 in Chinese. The point here is not to discuss exactly what the difference is, although since we were in a linguistics course, this is obviously what we did back then, but the point is that even very simple words such as bread and 面包 don't really mean the same thing in different languages, and that means that you could argue that 面包 is not translatable. You would have to explain what you meant in English using more words, and this one-to-one mapping between words that you think of when you open a beginner textbook simply is an illusion and nothing can be translated. Or then again, like I said, everything can be translated, it's just a matter of how efficient or how annoying it is. This brings us to the third question from Carmen, which is about using translation as a method for learning Chinese. And she's essentially asking, why do I focus on translation in the challenges? And this makes perfect sense. I mean, I started this episode by saying that you should not translate when you're speaking. You should not translate when you are listening, which can then be extended to reading and writing as well, where you shouldn't translate either. So why am I advocating translation as a method? For example, why is the challenge this month about translation if I'm telling you you shouldn't translate? Well, I think I can answer this in two ways. The first one is that translation is one of the uses we can put our language proficiency to. So being able to explain or tell somebody in their native language what something in Chinese means is very valuable. It is, of course, something you can work with professionally as a translator or interpreter. So being able to understand something in Chinese and express it in English, French, or some other language is useful. Naturally, translating to Chinese from other languages is also useful. Translation is not easy though, so you can be pretty good at two languages and still be bad at translating. So this is a skill that you need to develop, and that could be one of the reasons you want to practice translation. There is an additional reason why translation can be useful though, and that is as a learning method in itself. So regardless if you want to become a translator or if you want to actually use your proficiency for translation later. When it comes to translating to Chinese, you're starting with a text or some kind of source material, and you're now supposed to express this in Chinese. This can be nice because you don't need to create the content yourself. For example, if you write what you think, you need to also think about what you think first. But if you're trying to translate what somebody else thinks about something, well, their opinions are already there, and your job is to convey them in Chinese. It's also more important that you stay true to the source. I mean, if you are speaking yourself, you can say whatever you want. And if you're expressing your opinions, you can say something slightly different and nobody will care. It's your opinions and you are saying them. But if you're speaking for somebody else, it's more important that you stick closer to what they actually said. And this might encourage you to explore areas of the language where you normally don't spend too much time. And of course, if you're translating something about a topic you normally wouldn't talk about yourself, this is a great way to diversify your practice and make sure you cover things that you normally wouldn't. There is also a case to be made to spend time practicing translating from Chinese to your native language. In essence, this is a very active form of reading, because normally when we read and listen, understanding the gist might be enough, or at least we don't need to care about the nuance of every single word. When you're translating, however, you need to think what things really mean and how to express those in another language. So in essence, this forces you to pay attention to ambiguities and hazy understandings of words that you weren't probably aware of. In general, you know what a word means in Chinese, but when you're asked specifics about exactly what it means and which word is most appropriate to use in your native language, well, maybe then you start hesitating. So translating to your native language from Chinese is, like I said, a very active form of reading where you really need to pay attention to details. So what I'm saying here is that translation in both directions can be very useful. It helps you practice in ways you normally don't. It helps you to focus on language that you normally don't think that much about, and that can be beneficial for your Chinese proficiency in general. I want to make it very clear, though, that translation should not be an important part of the way you practice Chinese unless you want to become an interpreter or translator and your Chinese is already quite advanced. I'm a big advocate of extensive reading and listening, and the whole point there is to maybe not think too much about if you understand every single word, but listen for meaning and general understanding. But what I'm saying here that if you're already doing that, it can be rather helpful sometimes to pay attention to the very small things, at least some of the time. Such as this month when we have a translation challenge. So if you want to join that, check out the link in the description or go to challenges.hackingchinese.com. And while you're checking out the show notes, don't forget to fill in the listener survey. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.